Hi everybody and welcome back to a new episode of DiagnoseDan. Today we're working on a 2012 BMW 1 Series and this story is really crazy. This car stranded by the side of the road, then it was towed to a BMW dealership that wasn't able to fix it, then it was towed to an independent shop and that didn't fix it, and right now the car is here. It's a crank no start, so let's see if we can diagnose this one together. So the car came with an email and it goes like this. Dear Danny, we've got a BMW 1 Series F20 with an N13B 16A engine from 2012. This car stranded by the side of the road and was towed to a BMW dealership. That dealership diagnosed the vehicle and they told the customer the car had a lack of fuel pressure. Okay. They told the customer they needed to replace the low pressure fuel pump in the tank. The customer agreed. They replaced the low pressure fuel pump, but still a crank, no start and still no fuel pressure. Then they called the customer again and they told the customer the next step would be to replace the high pressure fuel pump, but it can also be a faulty injector or a faulty engine control unit or a bunch of other things. And they told the customer, what would you like us to replace next? I mean, they are the specialist, right? They lost the customer's credibility and the customer thought this is going to be expensive, they're just changing parts. So he got the car towed from the dealership to an independent shop. That independent shop replaced the high pressure fuel pump, but still a crank, no start and still no fuel pressure. Now the independent shop contacted me via this mail and they're asking us, Dan, can you diagnose this vehicle for us? So that's where we are right now. So let's see what we can do for them. Now, by the way, if you look right there, that's the Mercedes from my previous video. And since that video, I didn't touch that vehicle. The only thing I did is I drove it out of my diagnostic bay because I've got many cars waiting to be diagnosed. And this is one of our own cars, so it doesn't have priority. But as you can see, the module is still not installed. I didn't program it. I didn't do any work. The only thing I did is drive it out of my diagnostic bay. Now, when I did that, the car started misfiring. I had all kinds of warning lights, so I'm pretty sure this isn't the last thing you have seen of this vehicle, and it will probably star in a future video. Now, as always, let's start out by confirming the customer complaint and let's find out if this is a crank no start. Now, in the meanwhile, I hooked up a battery maintainer and I hooked up the scan tool. So once we've confirmed this is a crank no start, we can scan for fault codes and see if there are any fault codes stored that could lead us into the right direction. But let's start out by confirming that customer's complaint. Now, I just scanned the entire vehicle for fault codes, but in the entire vehicle, there is no fault code stored. Like when you go into the ECM, you will see there are no DTCs. Now, what I think is that at some point, either at the dealership or at the independent workshop, they cleared out all the codes, no DTC. Now, not very helpful at all, so let's see what our next step will be. Now, every time I got a case like this with no fault code stored, maybe because somebody else clearing them out, or sometimes a car doesn't set a code. Every time I have a case like that, I like to go back to the basics. And in this case, that's checking for spark, fuel, and compression, and there. Now, when an engine has got fuel, compression, air, and spark, it has to run. Now, it doesn't mean it has to run beautifully, but it has to do something. Now, this engine isn't doing anything at all, so something is very, very wrong. Now, since it's very convenient, on this engine, I want to start with spark. And if we confirm the engine has got spark, I like to go to the fuel system. I suspect something is wrong with that because the other shop and the dealership complained about the lack of fuel pressure. And maybe after that, go after air and timing and compression. But let's start out, just since it's convenient, to rule that out with checking for spark. Now, I quickly removed the cover from the engine. I removed the coil and I removed the spark plug, and I hooked up the spark plug to a known good ground. Now, also notice that this breather hose is broken. Now, that's not causing our crank no start, but it is something to keep in mind and something that needs to be taken care of later. Now, the next step, I'm gonna crank the engine over while you guys look for ignition. Now, as you could see quite clearly, we do have got spark, and that's a good thing because now we know that the engine computer is controlling the ignition coils. Now, I reinstalled the coil and the plug, and the next thing I want to go after is fuel. Now, the other shops were complaining about the lack of fuel pressure. So in the first step, I want to select the high pressure fuel data pit on the scan tool. I want to crank the engine over while you guys take a look at that pressure reading. Now, something very, very interesting just happened. As you see, we've got two graphs. The graph on the left is showing us the actual fuel pressure measured by the fuel pressure sensor on the fuel rail. On the right, we've got the fuel pressure that is desired by the engine control module. So this is the pressure the control module wants to see in order to let the engine run. Now, once we started cranking the engine over, the ECM was demanding 100 bars of fuel pressure. Now, when we started cranking over, the fuel pressure spiked but immediately dropped. Now, why did the fuel pressure, the actual fuel pressure, dropped out while the engine still wanted to see 100 bars of pressure? I guess that's the big question. Here at the back of the engine, we've got the high pressure fuel pump that runs off the camshaft. Now, the high pressure fuel pump has recently been replaced by an independent shop, and it is fed low pressure fuel through this fuel line through a low pressure fuel pump that has been replaced by the dealership. Now, just to make sure enough fuel or enough fuel pressure is making it to the high pressure fuel pump, in the next step, I want to take a pressure reading of the low pressure fuel system. Now, what I did is I hooked up my pressure sensor in between the high pressure fuel pump and the fuel line that comes from the tank, from the low pressure fuel pump that has been replaced by the dealership. I hooked that up to my universal pressure tester to make sure that enough pressure makes it to the high pressure fuel pump to do its job. As you saw, we had a nice and constant fuel pressure feeding the high pressure fuel pump, which I was expecting because the low pressure fuel pump is new. Now, if the high pressure fuel pump is being fed enough fuel and the high pressure fuel pump is also being replaced by a new one, why is it not delivering enough fuel pressure? Now, let's do a little experiment and let's try to find out if the lack of fuel pressure is the only problem this engine has got. If the lack of fuel pressure is the only problem of this engine, when I introduce an alternative fuel source, the engine will attempt to run. Now, I'm going to introduce an alternative fuel source into the intake right here. This is the air filter and this is the mass airflow sensor. And right now it's very convenient that this PCV hose is broken, and we will take care of that later. But for now, I'm going to introduce fuel, and if the fuel pressure is the only problem, then the engine will attempt to run. Now at the beginning of this diagnosis, we already learned that this engine has got spark. Now we also learned that we've got a lack of high fuel pressure. But we just introduced an alternative fuel into the cylinders. Now if the engine is mechanically sound and we've got spark and fuel, it should attempt to run. Now as you can hear, it was doing absolutely nothing. It was not even trying to run. So could there be an explanation for the engine not running with spark and fuel and not having high fuel pressure? Now since this engine is not attempting to run with fuel and spark, I suspect there's something mechanically wrong with it. So what I did is I hooked up my picoscope and I hooked up 2 channels to both the exhaust cam sensor and the intake cam sensor right here. I hooked up the 3rd channel to the crank sensor on the flywheel underneath the engine, and in the next step I want to catch the cam crank waveform and compare it to a known good one. Now this is the waveform we just recorded. Now all we need to do is zoom into this waveform, separate the channels and compare it to a known good one. The benefit of using a picoscope in this case is that it comes with a waveform library. The waveform we've captured wouldn't mean anything to us without comparing it to a known good. So I went into the Pico library, I entered N13, which is the engine code for this engine, and I found 2 known good cam crank waveforms. I compared both of them to each other and they were identical. I downloaded one of them and we're going to compare that known good to the waveform we've captured from the engine we're working on. Now when we take a look at the waveform we've captured, and especially to the waveform of the camshafts, we can see 2 narrow towers. Now when we compare both narrow towers of the exhaust and the intake camshaft, we can see there's quite a lot of room in between them. But when we take a look at the known good waveform, we can see that both narrow towers exactly line up, and this is quite typical, and this is what you see on a lot of vehicles. Now, when we compare the tower, the narrow tower that's closest to the missing tooth on the crankshaft, we can see that in our engine there are 19 teeth in between that small tower and the missing tooth on the crankshaft. Now on the known good engine, that's only 7 teeth. So that means we've definitely got a timing problem. Our engine is not timed correctly. Now I suspect that when the car stranded, something went wrong with the timing of the engine. The other shops concentrated on the low fuel pressure, but this was just an effect of the timing being off. But how can the timing affect the pressure of the high pressure fuel pump? Now in order to explain to you how the timing of the engine can affect the fuel pressure, I actually removed the high pressure fuel pump from this engine. Now this is basically quite a simple pump. Low pressure fuel comes in the top and high pressure fuel comes out of the side. Now this basically is a mechanical pump that's mechanically being driven from a cam on the camshaft. So this is a cam follower and the pump is located on the side of the cylinder head and it's being pushed by a cam on the camshaft. Now every time the cam pushes on this piston, it pressurizes the system. Now just like the intake and exhaust valves, the timing of those are being controlled by the cam on the camshaft. When the system is being pressurized, so when the cam pushes on this piston, is also being controlled by a cam on the camshaft. Now if this pump was purely mechanical, the full stroke of the piston would always be 100% effective. So we would always have maximum fuel pressure. Now we don't always need and we don't always want maximum fuel pressure. And there's where this electronically controlled valve comes in. Now let's imagine the cam pushes on this piston and it pushes the piston halfway in, so 50% down the way. Let's say then we close this valve and then the system starts pressurizing. Now only 50% of the stroke was effective and we only have 50% of the fuel pressure. So by controlling this valve, we can control the fuel pressure. Now, in order to do this, this valve needs to know exactly where this piston is moving, in which direction, and where it is located. Is it moving in? Is it moving out? Is it 25% in? Is it 50% in? Or 75% in? Now, normally this is not a problem because the cam on the camshaft is timed and it comes at a fixed time. Now, unless the timing is off, it could be that this valve is thinking the piston is moving in, but it's actually moving out. Now, this can result in either too high or too low fuel pressures when the timing is off. Now, although I think my diagnosis is right, there's one thing that was still bothering me, and that's something the independent workshop wrote in their mail. In the first mail they sent me, they stated they did some checks, and one of the things they checked was the timing. Now, this is the original mail, and although it's in Dutch, you can clearly see that over here it says that they checked the timing and the timing is good. Now, how can they check the timing and the timing is good if our waveform is way off? So that kind of bothered me. So I decided to do an in-cylinder pressure test. Now, that waveform didn't look good either. There are spikes in there that are not supposed to be there. So I was thinking, how did they check the timing? Maybe they checked the timing mechanically. So that's what I did. I mechanically timed this engine, and right now the crankshaft is in time. The locking tool is in the crankshaft. And I also got the locking tools for the camshafts, but there is no purpose in installing them because the camshafts are way off. When the crankshaft is in time, the cams of the first cylinder should face upwards and outwards, but this one is kind of facing upwards, but not outwards, and this one is actually facing down. Now, you can also see that there's a huge amount of slack in the chain. And a big giveaway something is wrong here is the shiny part right here. There's supposed to be a chain guide right here. And when we actually look behind the chain right there, we can find the plastic part of that guide. And when we dig a little bit deeper and take a pair of pliers, I think we can retrieve the metal part of the bracket of that chain guide that was supposed to be right there. So I guess that's diagnosis confirmed. Now, how did that other workshop check the timing? I have absolutely no idea. Now, why did the dealership replace the low pressure fuel pump? You would imagine that a fuel pressure test is quite a basic test that a dealership would be able to perform. Now, maybe the pump was really broken, but that would mean that multiple failures occurred at exactly the same time. And that is highly unlikely. Now, when we first started the car, we saw a spike in fuel pressure, and I think that was an attempt of the ECM trying to control the fuel pressure, and when it saw it wasn't rising fast enough, it stopped controlling the fuel pressure altogether. Now, why didn't that or the timing set a fault code? I'm not sure, but it might only set fault code while the engine is running and not during cranking. So I can imagine there were fault codes before, but either the dealership or the independent workshop deleted those. Now, the next time you got a fuel pressure code from a mechanically timed pump, remember that the timing can actually affect your fuel pressure. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe to my channel, and when you hit the little bell, you will get a notification each time I upload a new video. And remember, DiagnoseDan fixed it again. See you next time, guys.